One of the lesser-known consequences of the Korean War had nothing to do with combat losses or shifting front lines. It had to do with wood. Entire barracks, bridges, supply depots, and defensive structures failed early, not because of enemy action, but because timber rotted, warped, or collapsed under conditions planners believed they understood. Modern armies discovered often too late that untreated or poorly prepared wood decays rapidly when exposed to moisture, microbes, and seasonal stress. What's overlooked is that this wasn't a new lesson at all. Centuries earlier, Viking societies had already solved this problem in ways that modern builders and militaries largely forgot. If this kind of overlooked material-level history matters to you, subscribe to the channel. History Vault exists to examine the decisions beneath the battles, the choices that determined whether people endured or failed long before an enemy appeared. Wood has always been a strategic material, not a neutral one. Timber isn't just a construction resource. In pre-industrial societies, it was infrastructure, transportation, shelter, and defense all at once. For Viking-age Scandinavia, wood determined whether ships survived long voyages, whether hulls stood through winters, and whether fortifications lasted beyond a single generation. The environment was unforgiving. Cold, wet conditions encouraged fungal growth and insect damage. Salt air degraded fibers. Freeze-thaw cycles split untreated beams. The common modern assumption is that Vikings simply used better wood or relied on luck. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. They treated timber deliberately, often ritualistically, using methods that slowed decay so effectively that some structures and ships survived for centuries in hostile conditions. The so-called ritual was a preservation system disguised as tradition. What modern observers often call a ritual was, in practice, a disciplined material process. Timber selected for ships, longhouses, or defensive works was rarely used fresh. Trees were felled at specific times of year, often in winter, when sap content was lowest. Lower sap meant less internal moisture and fewer sugars for microbes to feed on. This single decision dramatically increased longevity. After felling, wood was not rushed into construction. It was soaked, buried, smoked, or left to season under controlled exposure. In several Scandinavian sites, logs were submerged in cold water or bogs for extended periods. This leached sugars from the wood and altered its chemical structure, making it resistant to rot and insects. What appears ceremonial was, in effect, biochemical engineering. One of the most effective Viking practices involved immersing timber in bogs or streams. Oxygen-poor environments slowed microbial activity. Minerals in peat-rich water penetrated the wood, inhibiting decay. Over time, this process produced timber that resisted rot far better than air-dried wood. Ship timbers, recovered from burial mounds, show evidence of prolonged water treatment before construction. This wasn't accidental. It required planning, labor coordination, and patience, traits associated with survival-focused cultures. The result was ships capable of surviving decades of use in saltwater environments that destroy untreated wood within years. Another overlooked practice was controlled smoking and surface charring. Viking builders exposed timber to smoke rich in phenols and resins, compounds that, inhibit fungi and insects. In some cases, beams were lightly charred, sealing surface fibers and reducing moisture absorption. Pine tar, distilled from resin-rich wood, was applied extensively to ships and structures. This wasn't just waterproofing. So, tar-penetrated fibers repelled insects and even slowed bacterial growth. Over time, the smell and appearance became culturally associated with ships and halls, which, really reinforced the practice across generations. A long ship that survives multiple voyages is honestly a strategic asset, and a hall that stands for generations, well, that anchors political authority. Defensive palisades that don't rot, they actually maintain territorial control. The Viking ability to project power across oceans depended as much on wood preservation as on navigation or arms. This connection between material science and military reach is often ignored in favor of romantic narratives. But without durable timber, Viking expansion would have been limited by constant reconstruction. Their wood practices extended operational ranges and reduced logistical burdens. During the Korean War, rapid construction relied on untreated or minimally treated wood. Harsh winters, heavy rains, and microbial activity degraded structures quickly. Engineers focused on speed, not longevity. The result was failure under stress, collapsed bridges, unsafe housing, and compromised defenses. What's striking is that, the solutions developed afterward, like pressure treatment, chemical preservatives, and controlled seasoning, really echo practices Viking societies used centuries earlier, just with industrial tools. The difference is that Vikings embedded these processes into cultural norms, ensuring consistency even without a centralized engineering doctrine. Viking wood treatment wasn't optional. It was, embedded in craft guilds, oral tradition, and communal expectation. Skipping steps meant risking structural failure that affected the entire community. Over time, these practices took on symbolic meaning, but their persistence was driven by results. This is a critical survival lesson. Techniques that work become tradition. Ritual is often the memory of hard-won knowledge preserved across generations without written manuals. So, the Viking approach to timber, really shows a mindset oriented toward long-term survival rather than just short-term efficiency. They invested time up front to avoid failure later, and they understood the environment as an adversary equal to any enemy. This perspective applies far beyond woodworking. It actually explains why certain societies endure stress while others, collapse under it. Material choices, preparation timelines, and respect for environmental forces often matter more than tactical brilliance. History isn't only about conflicts. It's also about the systems that made survival possible before, during, and after them. The Viking wood preservation practices remind us that durability is engineered, not assumed. Whether in ancient Scandinavia or 20th century Korea, ignoring material reality carries consequences. Understanding how past societies solved these problems really expands our sense of what preparedness actually means. It shifts focus from reaction to foresight, from improvisation to design. If you value this kind of deep, material-level historical analysis, go ahead and subscribe to History Vault and share this video. These stories matter because they show how survival is built, often quietly, patiently, and far from the battlefield, long before history takes notice.